Okay, this is AQA Psychology, and this is the topic of social learning as applied to gender development and the influence of culture in particular on gender roles. And first of all, why do we look at culture? So the reason is when we look at what's influencing gender roles, looking at how it differs between cultures is quite useful because it can tell us what's at the root of our gender role behaviour. So if, for example, if culture or social factors are at the root of causing our different gender roles, then we would expect to see that gender would differ between different cultures. If it's more social causes between different societies in different cultures, then we would find it differs between different cultures. If, however, it's biology that influences our gender roles, such as our chromosomes or our brain structure, then we would expect to see, as we look across different cultures, that actually gender roles are universal, that we have many similarities across a number of different cultures. If we find that, we can say actually it's more to do with human biology than social factors, because social factors differ between different cultures, while actually biology is largely similar. So that's why we look at culture and gender. So what have we actually found? We're going to look at a number of pieces of research here. The first piece is by someone called Mead, who went to Papua New Guinea and completed a number of different participant observations. If you remember, that's where you take part, you go into the culture, you become a member of the culture, you would live with them, observe them, ask them questions, they know you're there, you're participating in it, you're not a hidden sort of non-participant outside. So she looked at 3 different tribes. The first tribe, the Arapesh, she found that both sexes were caring and cooperative, so they both had a sort of feminine role, what we would call a feminine role. The Mandugamore tribe, both sexes were aggressive and warlike, so quite different. They both in that tribe had more of a masculine role. And then the last one that she looked at, the Chambuli tribe, they actually had opposite gender roles to our traditional gender roles, where the men were involved in the childcare and the women were involved in trading and providing. So 3 quite different results there from 3 different tribes, which obviously suggests that it's cultural factors that are really influencing gender. Possible issues with this study: it's a participant observation, which is good because you can get lots of detail and so on, but that means that you're really involved in the research, and it can really cause quite a lot of investigator bias when you take part in an observation like that. And in fact, her findings do fit her own ideas. Her belief before this study was that gender was socially constructed, and she's actually found that. She's found that the roles of gender are very different in these 3 different societies, and it could be that she's not consciously but unconsciously choosing the information that fits with her finding, or asking questions in a certain way so that she gets certain answers, not consciously but unconsciously, because that's really what she wants to find from her research. So that's a big issue which could really affect the validity of that study. Right, more research. Monroe and Monroe, they did a cultural comparison of many different cultures, and they found that in all societies females were involved in these things in some way, not necessarily like they did all the childcare, but they were involved at least a little bit in the childcare and the food preparation in all societies, and that they showed compliance, things like nurturing and so on. And then on the other hand, males in all societies were raised in this way, that they were raised to be independent, self-reliant and to achieve. So this study is finding the opposite really of Mead's study, that gender is more universal rather than culturally bound, so that perhaps it's more related to biology or caused by biology. Here's another cultural comparison. Females in all societies were seen as nurturing, while males in all societies were self-reliant. So again, that's finding a universal feature of gender across many different societies, suggesting again biology rather than social factors affecting gender. So that's three contradictory studies. Mead's study suggesting social factors and the other two suggesting biological factors. So the fact that these last two support a biological explanation, that can be linked to evolutionary psychology. They would say that because men and women have reproductive differences, that the women carry the children, that leads to these universal features of gender across all cultures. For example, women can breastfeed and men can't, so it's only natural that they would be involved in childcare, at least for the first part of their children's lives, and that then may naturally carry on to be a feature of gender in their society. Equally, men tend to be more broad-shouldered and so on. There are various biological differences there which mean that they're more equipped for hunting and trading as a general rule. So evolutionary psychologists would say that these universal differences across many different cultures have evolved as a natural result of reproductive differences. And that can explain why those two studies did find those universal features. It's worth bearing in mind that all research is always a natural experiment when you're looking at different cultures. So you can't ever do an experiment where you manipulate the IV. You just can't manipulate the IV of culture. It's not possible. So you can't really draw cause and effect from any of these studies. It's simply comparisons between different cultures. And the problem with that is that so many different factors vary between cultures. Obviously, when we do an experiment, we want to manipulate the IV so we can isolate the IV and keep everything else constant. If you think about that, it's simply not possible because culture is made up of so many different features. It's just too complex to be able to change one thing, to just change culture and keep everything else constant. It wouldn't work. So you can't ever say what the cause of any differences is. Even if you can say that culture is the cause, what in particular? Culture is kind of quite a woolly construct that includes many different things. So how would you work out what the cause is? So it's quite hard to say what the root issue is here. And then equally, culture has different effects on the people that live in it. Some cultures produce a really high level of conformity. So let's imagine that two different cultures both had the same ideas about gender, that men should be the breadwinner and women should do the childcare. In those two cultures, even if they have the same view of gender, people may conform to it more in one culture than in another. So collectivist cultures produce the highest level of conformity and individualistic cultures produce the lowest level of conformity. So people in individualistic cultures feel more able to be flexible and to go against their culture's idea of gender than those in collectivist cultures. So that shows that culture can differ in its influence of how much it influences people's behaviour. And then also, just to be aware, gender is the result of a really complex interaction of many different factors. Perhaps we're asking the wrong question to say what is this one thing that's behind it. It's good to try and isolate things that are affecting it, but we're never going to be able to say, oh, it's this one thing that causes gender, or this one thing that causes gender roles to be this way, because there's biological factors to take into account, social factors, environmental factors. There's so many different factors that affect gender, and then there's also the way that they interact with each other. So we're never going to be able to say, oh, culture is what affects gender, or media is what affects gender, or cognitive factors are what causes gender. It's just not like that. So we have to bear in mind at all times that it's a really complex thing that we're dealing with.